So this is me. My name is Alistair. I presented a session this morning. We'll see if my microphone's working. I presented a session this morning at, can you guys hear that? Yeah, okay. I presented a session this morning on lean analytics, and I'll talk a little about what that is. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about the challenges of applying lean analytics to large organizations. We heard a bunch of different versions of what cloud computing is this morning, or this afternoon, sorry. One person said cloud is everything as a service. One person said cloud was hybridization of technologies. I'm here to tell you that I think cloud computing is about small batches, and that small batches change everything. So has anybody here read the book, The Lean Startup? How many of you are familiar with the concept of lean startup? So I'm a Montrealer, but I spend a lot of time in Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley, people are obsessed with this word, lean startup. It's not so prevalent elsewhere. There's a book called Running Lean that my mother thought was a book about losing weight by jogging. And when we came out with lean analytics, people thought I was maybe the before poster for weight loss and analyzing your body mass. Anyway, in 2011, 2011, 2008, Eric Ries wrote this book, The Lean Startup, which came from the original blog post he put on his website. Fast forward a few years, Eric Ries is now training the Fortune 500 in how to use lean startup. And he's spending a lot of time with companies like General Electric, training 400,000 employees in how to apply this model to large organizations. And the reason for that is that it's a very systematic way of understanding how to manage innovation in large companies. Now, there's a lot more to what Eric's talking about than just being thinking iteratively. But the reality is that this idea of the lean model, going from a very niche blog by a tech startup guy who was one of the people involved in IMVU, to training 400,000 General Electric employees worldwide in a few short years is remarkable. In fact, it escalated much, much faster than anybody thought. And there's a reason for this. Steve Blank, who is one of the sort of grandfathers of entrepreneurship and innovation at Stanford, says that a startup's job, the reason you form a startup, is to find a sustainable, repeatable business model. The corollary to that, of course, is that when you're a big company, you have a different mission. Your mission is to perpetuate a sustainable, repeatable business model. And you're in the business of perpetuating things. Instead of saying companies are what they repeatedly do, one might say organizations that do things repeatedly are companies. So if you are a company and you're set up to try and repeat the same process, automate it, scale it out, then you are essentially a large organization and your focus is to perpetuate a known business model. And this represents a real challenge if you're trying to innovate. Once upon a time, the way you did this, the way you got your organization to grow predictably was scale. And how do you go about perpetuating something? How do you go about making it consistent? Well, it turns out that if you hate the job you get in a large enterprise, it's because of this gentleman. His name was Daniel Craig McCallum. McCallum was a Civil War veteran who was put in charge of managing a stretch of railroad in North America as they were building transcontinental railroads. McCallum was a smart guy, but he noticed that as railroad spans extended beyond 50 miles, things sort of went pear-shaped. There's a real problem in management. There were lots of breakdowns and issues and failures to communicate. And so he instituted a structure where each 50-mile stretch of railroad was run by a different person, and they reported up a chain to managers and so on. He brought in the military hierarchy he'd had in the war and applied it to the railroad. And for this, he is widely recognized as the father of the org chart. He recognized that by structuring the way people work in groups of hierarchical groups, what you wound up with was predictability at scale. So if you hate your job, it's probably because of Daniel McCallum. And large companies decided that they would adopt this model because it gave them predictability, repeatability, and systems like that. Unfortunately, for big companies, that's not working out so well. They're not being very innovative. If you go and look at the lifespan of the Fortune 500 companies over time, there has been a precipitous decline in the number of years that the average Fortune 500 company stays on the Fortune 500 Standards & Poor's Index. In fact, in 1950, if you were a Fortune 500 company, you were probably going to stay there for about 75 years. By 2010, that had dropped to 15 years. That went from a human lifespan to part of a career. More frighteningly for these big companies, if you are trying to innovate by entering a new business, Depending on who you ask, there's a 95 to 99% chance you will fail in doing so. The days of a big company are numbered. And the innovation problem, this idea of trying to innovate, isn't new. I mean, the real challenge here is we got to build new stuff and launch it and find new markets, but existing companies don't do that. Their DNA is to perpetuate something, not to discover a new market. Companies die all the time because they fail to find new business models. And this is better outlined nowhere better outlined than in The Innovator's Dilemma, the book by Clay Christensen. How many people here have read the book? So I'll give you a quick crash course in it. He talks about hard drives. And he chose the hard drive industry because, as he says, the hard drives are the fruit flies of technology industries. Evolutionary theorists study fruit flies because they have a very small lifespan, so you can run a test and demonstrate evolution in the species. He does the same thing with hard drive because hard drive companies live and die very quickly. So in his book, he talks about the hard drives that were sold for mainframes that had a 14-inch wide platter. And then he says there's another variant of those that had 8-inch platters for mini computers, the 5.25-inch hard drive that you had inside your desktop, and the 3.5-inch hard drive that's in the notebook. And you could carry this progression on out to SSD flash drives and mini drives that go inside iPods and things like that. And what's interesting when you look at the companies in the hard drive industry over the years, no company that was in one of these survived to be in the next one. And the prevailing wisdom was that once you got into, let's say, the 8-inch hard drive market, the technology was so daunting that by the time you had customers, you had to deal with those customers. You didn't have time to innovate. And Christensen debunked this. He went and looked at the companies and said, those companies in the 5.25-inch market were actually using less cool technology, less performant, less predictable. What happened was this. The people selling 8-inch hard drives didn't go down market. When they first came out, 5.25-inch drives were worse in almost every respect than big organizations. 5.25-inch drives had a horrible problem because 5.25-inch drives were unperformant, slow, didn't have the same megabytes per second on the device. They had a big issue in almost every respect except one. It turns out that the 8-inch drive vendors were building things in a more advanced fashion than the small people wanted. So they were building stuff for the CIOs who were asking for more storage, more density, faster, bigger. Meanwhile, the low-end customers came into the market, didn't have such demanding needs, but they had a new set of needs. The low-end customers wanted something entirely different because the customers for the 8-inch drive were focused on storage capacity and performance. The 5.25-inch customers that suddenly appeared wanted portability. They wanted something that would fit on a desktop. The criteria that the smaller market brought to bear was not something obvious to big companies. And this is something that's happening in the cloud computing space. If you look at Amazon Web Services, for example, in the server computing model, the traditional market for buying a physical server was things like density, heat, gigahertz, MIPS, other metrics that you looked at for a physical device. And the metrics you used to judge that were CapEx, financing, total cost of ownership, return on investment, the traditional enterprise IT stuff, which meant the salesperson would go play golf with the CIO from enterprise IT. Now consider for a minute the cloud computing model. So in the cloud computing model, you have a similar set of criteria shift where the first cloud computers were more expensive than servers, less efficient, far less reliable, less performant. In every metric that you would ask a CIO they cared about, the cloud instances did less well than the enterprise sort of vertically scalable, highly componentized, highly available server. But they were really good in a new set of criteria: operating expense, demand, time to spin up. So the CTO and the app owner and the line of business and the startup were very interested in that. Notice an entirely different market here. The buyer for the traditional enterprise stuff was the CIO. As a consequence of this, what we found was that the new customers for this, the CTO, the shadow IT, the application owner, the line of business, the startup, were much more interested in public clouds, even though they did not meet any of the criteria. And some of the presentations you've heard today, I'm kind of trampling on here because those criteria from enterprises are great, but they're coming out 10 years after the cloud criteria emerged. What happened was you could now build a very performant computer using cloud systems by massively parallelizing a large number of cheap computers. You could build a very resilient application by using multiple layers of cloud failover and availability in a public environment. And so what the problem is not that cloud computing is new and cool and sexy. It's that the people who built true public clouds were talking to a different customer. If you go in the criteria that traditional CIOs would want for a cloud, almost every criteria they wanted, public clouds like Amazon Web Services and Google Compute Engine, and to some extent even Microsoft Azure, fail on. But they succeed on entirely different criteria that are relevant to a new market. Now, this is why public clouds have a real problem in the industry today. And this is actually a problem called local maxima. So if you look at any market, any industry, pretend you are here in a market. You could get better climbing up the hill in this model, and you could optimize your current metrics. Let's say you're selling stuff, you're a bookshop, or you're a Blockbuster. You're selling something, and you could organize better promotions, come up with better pricing. You could use data to optimize the metrics you want. That will get you to what's called the local maximum, the best possible operating conditions for your current business model and your current framework. True innovation means changing the rules. You have to get to what's called a global maximum, something that's better by redefining what's possible. And the challenge, of course, with most companies is that short-term investors hate going downhill. There's a reason why Apple is very successful in building long-term products, because Steve Jobs was resistant to short-term investor hijinks and had controlling interests in a large part of the board. So this ability to go find the global maxima is terrifying and very, very important, and it's also something that when you get big and have shareholders to answer to, it's very hard to do. If you are someone in a large organization, you are by definition, if you're trying to innovate, going against the organizational DNA of perpetuating the existing business model. If you're selling servers and you say we should go to this cloud model and make a public cloud, the traditional enterprise IT buyers are going to say, we don't want that. We want bigger, faster, more dense, and so on. And you'll say, but the thing I'm proposing is less secure. It's less fast. It's less reliable. You can't kick it and see it. It's probably costs more. I mean, imagine trying to pitch that internally. You're a pariah. Innovators in large organizations tend to look like pariahs. They're bad listeners. I mean, you have to willfully ignore feedback from your very best customers. This is the classic problem in the innovator's dilemma. They're cannibals. If you're successful, you're going to destroy existing revenue streams. If you sell a Windows license in a box, Microsoft is moving to the Office as a live service, but they have a tremendous amount of resistance in some ways from people who want to buy it as a box, whereas somebody who didn't have a box version of a software doesn't have to compete with itself in that regard. And this is a real challenge. If you're going to be innovative and make the big steps, like Microsoft is doing to move to a live product, you have to overcome the resistance because you're going to some extent, eat your young. You're seen as a job killer. You tend to do things cheaper, more automation, lower margins traditionally when you go through this kind of innovation. You are a security risk. You're advocating openness. You're advocating communities, transparency. You're often a narcissist because you really worry about how am I going to get attention for this product or service. And you're kind of a slumlord. Initially, you're selling to the weirdos and the deviants. Back in the day when they were selling 5.25-inch drives, they were selling to people like Steve Jobs, who looked really weird and was not the kind of person they'd expect to sell hard drives to. So if you're trying to innovate in a large organization, you have your work cut out for you because you are essentially the opposite of everything that organization stands for. But there is hope. And I love Lego Star Wars because it means George Lucas doesn't sue me. Small batches change everything. I think clouds are about small batches. If you look at most of the tech about small batches, what do I mean by small batches? First of all, 3D printing. I can make a prototype very, very easily. Cloud computing, or any form of shared services. Anything where I take a service and I share it as a tool among multiple people is an example of something done in small batches. Social platforms that allow me to communicate with an individual user on a one-to-one basis. Social platforms are small. Kickstarter, ShopLocket, other crowdfunding systems allow me to do things in small batches. Digital channels that allow me to connect to an individual user and market directly to them and sell directly to them are small batches. All of these technologies are moving us to a world where the prototype costs what the product does. Let that sink in for a minute. The prototype costs what the product does. Everything you know about business and about supply and demand and about scale is predicated on this idea that there are economies of scale. And I think that is a doomed lesson. In the lean startup, we talk about this model where there's a constant cycle of building something, measuring something, and learning from it. You're not building a product, you're building a product to figure out what product to build. But in a small batch world, cycle time beats scale. Someone else who can make 1,000 products cheaply now has to compete with someone who can make one product for the same price, where the first unit is the same price as the millionth unit, where the cost of spinning up a server for the first player of Titanfall is the same as the cost of spinning up the server for the millionth player of Titanfall. When the world moves to small batch economies, where the cost of the prototype is the same as the cost of the product, what will win is your cycle time, not your scale. This is a terrifying lesson for large organizations that have relied on scale as a barrier to entry for decades. Successful businesses must become organisms that are designed to learn continuously. So I talked about innovation earlier. The companies I've talked to, I spent the last year since Lean Analytics came out talking to big organizations. I mean really big organizations, like Fortune 500. Many of them saying, how do we learn to do what's happening in startups? Ultimately, there are three kinds of innovation. There's the sustaining or core innovation. This is doing more of the same thing. It's absolutely necessary. It commands about 70% of the organization's resources. And it's either improving along current metrics, this is the local maxima optimization, doing what Sergio Zyman calls selling more things to more people for more money, more efficiently, more often. That's his definition of marketing. More things to more people, more efficiently, for more money, more often. Or it's changing the slope of that curve so you're actually automating those processes and getting better faster. The second kind of innovation is this adjacent innovation, where you take one part of your business model and you move. So you're essentially saying, I'm going to change my market, or I'm going to change my product, or I'm going to change my method. One of those three. You may have heard the term product market fit. I think companies innovate along three vectors. They innovate on market, they innovate on product, and they innovate on metric. I'll give you an example. Amazon is a bookseller. When Amazon started, it was selling books, traditional product, to readers, existing market. There wasn't anything innovative about there. The innovation was the method. They took electronic orders, and they shipped things out through a concentrated warehouse. So what they were innovating on initially was method. Product was the same, market was the same, method was new. Then they introduced the e-reader, the Kindle, which was a new product. That was product innovation. Now they had a new way to sell to their existing customers using their existing method. And then the Kindle had a side effect of, now I can read books in large type, which meant I could get to readers who were legally blind, who previously only had access to a very small range of books. That was new market. When companies innovate, they do so along one of those three vectors, usually. The third kind of transformation is when you're changing more than one of those things. You're fundamentally altering the business model. This is where you're jumping across that. And so what I've seen along large companies is they have a three maxima approach to innovation. They have the current state model, where they are today, and they're using big data and data mining and data science and a lot of other things to optimize their existing business model. They're innovating along either the product or the market or the method to get to an adjacent business model, and then they're disrupting an entire business model and rethinking themselves, reframing who they are to move across here. So generally speaking, you can convince executives to do the adjacent innovation because they're familiar with it. Over here is terrifying because it eats their young. Now, one of the allies you have as an entrepreneur in this market is the ability to embrace data. In the 1930s, as broadcast radio was rolling out across North America, there was something called Arbitron that appeared. These were listening diaries that they would give out to people in a certain demographic. So Hispanic men aged 20 to 25. Take one of these diaries, write down what you listen to every 15 minutes on the radio, and send it to me. The data was collected quarterly and published, and it was used to determine advertising prices. It was also used to figure out market share for radio stations. And the radio stations quickly learned to play with the data. So for example, they would, you know those contests the radio station puts on in the morning? Dial in and if you're the fourth caller. They would always do those at like 8:28 in the morning, because that way you got the coveted 8:15 to 8:30 and 8:30 to 8:45 time. They would also repeat their call signs more towards the end of the week, knowing people would fill this out at the end of the week. And this changed in 2008 when Arbitron introduced something called the PPM, or the Personal Performance Meter. This is a small device that clips to your belt that basically knows what you're listening to. So it records the audio inaudibly in some kind of radio broadcast, and it figures out what station you're listening to. So if you walk into a mall and they're playing Enya, you love Enya. See, that's called localization. I would have said country music in the US, but no. So they would figure out what you're playing, and it would know what you listen to, and it would flag you as a listener of ethereal, easy listening. I'm not sure what genre Enya is. But it would flag you as a listener of that kind of music for that 15 minutes, regardless of your preferences. This had a huge tectonic shift impact on the industry. Radio stations with a 50% rating went down to 30%. Most importantly, this is why modern music sucks, and I can prove it. In 2007, if a song was in heavy rotation, meaning it was popular, it got played every 4 hours. In 2012, a heavy rotation song is played every 55 minutes. This is directly due to Arbitron. It happened in every market Arbitron was turned on in that market, because they know what song makes you stick around and what song makes you leave. It's also why pop music becomes very popular for a while and then vanishes from the charts instantly. The harsh light of data is a terrifying thing for pop music, but it's really good for entrepreneurs. Good entrepreneurs do several things well. They take baby steps. When Netflix came out, it wasn't called Postal Flix, it was called Netflix, because they knew that long-term broadcast streaming of video was going to be popular. They couldn't get there yet, so they used the postal system as a proxy to learn the business model before they went to broadcast. When Tesla first put out a car, they put out a Model S. It was a sports car. Elon Musk was derided for creating a sports car. The world doesn't need a new one. And yet in a blog post shortly before releasing it, he said, our first car is going to be a sports car because we need to use that. Sports car owners have a tolerance for certain things. We need to work the engineering out. Our third car will be an affordable vehicle for everyone. Twitter. Everyone's forgotten why Twitter is 140 characters. It's because it's SMS minus 20 characters for your name. When Twitter launched, not enough people had broadband and smartphones, so Twitter worked with SMS. Can you imagine using Twitter on SMS today? What a nightmare. But the reason for the 140 character limitation is they knew they needed the baby step of SMS to get themselves to the market. Good entrepreneurs also reframe a business. I talked earlier about Blockbuster. Why didn't Blockbuster become Netflix? Well, there's a bunch of reasons why. I mean, Blockbuster had tons going for it, right? It had an amazing amount of video store inventory, but that matters much less than the fact that it had market intelligence, it had customers' permission to charge them, it has their existing payment history, what they liked, it had all sorts of stuff going for it. The problem was framing. Blockbuster thought it was in the video store rental business, and it made money from late fees. Netflix said it was in the entertainment delivery business. Using the innovator's dilemma again, the eyes through which Blockbuster viewed their business were terrifying, because they said late fees are important. That Netflix thing has no late fees, it can't possibly be good. I'll give you a much more emotional example. A friend of mine is the CIO at MetLife, a large American insurance company. I have no emotional commitment to an insurance company. All they do is pay out money when someone dies. Gary Hoberman is trying to innovate this in a few ways, and one of his ideas is something called Infinity. Infinity is an app available in the US App Store. And I talked to Gary, and he said, you know, I think the insurance company has a different role to play. I think the insurance company can be the curator of your legacy. It's a much broader reframing than I'm going to pay out after you die. So they launched this app. Have a look at this app. Our favorite holiday, our first time together, away together as a family. A video message from my wife saying goodbye to you, my love. Is that the first time you've had an emotional reaction to an insurance company? Here's all my banking information, passwords and account details. Photos of you growing up, so proud of you. Every time I talk about this, I'm like a little emotional, right? But wait, it's actually okay for an insurance company to do this. Like when I get past the weepy feeling of there's something in my eye, I start to think maybe that is what an insurance company becomes. Maybe it should reframe itself as the company that curates your legacy after you die. And maybe I'm okay with that. I love this example because the Blockbuster horse already left the barn. This is a concrete example of something happening right now. And finally, good entrepreneurs are subversive. In Houston, there was a conveyor belt for baggage, and they got frequent complaints from customers that the bags, they had to wait too long for their bags to come out. So the city undertook a multi-million-dollar innovation program to try and fix the speed of bag delivery. After a lot of work, they got the time it took the bags to go from the planes to the carousel from 9 minutes down to 6 minutes. It's a Sisyphean effort by any undertaking. And then they did a bunch of surveys, and the number one complaint, I have to wait too long for my bags to come out. And then an enterprising civil servant decided he'd try something and parked the planes further away from the carousel for a month. Complaints went to zero. Because the problem wasn't my bags take too long, it's I have to wait too long for my bags. And with that insight, they could have instead said, maybe we should put iPads at the terminal, or mirrors, or some other activity. So entrepreneurs look at all the possible things they could do to fix something and pick the one that gives them a quick answer in a short amount of time. Again, back to that short cycle time that everybody needs. Ultimately, good entrepreneurs know that cycle time trumps scale. So when you're spending time talking about cloud computing, when you're spending time talking about technology and whether it matters to business, the lesson I want you to take away is that almost every technical innovation we've talked about today is in the service of doing things in smaller batches that speed up the rate of experimentation. And that by experimenting more quickly, we can get to a shorter cycle time that ultimately leads to much better innovation and replaces scale with the ability to learn faster than your competitors. If you want to yell at me, I'm Croll on Twitter. I write about this stuff and other stuff at tiltthewindmill.com. Thank you very much.